The Agar system burned for 80 days before the High Command authorized the use of the final desperate measures. The sky over the primary hive world of Orestes Verfeu was no longer blue or grey, but a churning bruise of purple and black smoke. The Black Legion had arrived with 3 battle barges and a crusade force of traitor Astartes that numbered in the thousands. They did not rush. They did not make mistakes. They dismantled the orbital defences of Orestes V with the cold precision of a butcher separating meat from bone. On the surface, Lord General Hector Vance watched the strategic displays in his command bunker. The displays flickered with static. The machine spirit of the hololith was dying, much like his men. Vance was 70 years old. He had served in 3 crusades. He had never seen a slaughter like this. The trenches outside the hive city were filled with the frozen mud of a nuclear winter and the bodies of 3 million Imperial Guardsmen. The logistics reports were worse than the casualty lists. The hive city had food for 2 more days. The water recycling plants had failed a week ago. The citizens were drinking the filtered runoff of the cooling pipes. Disease was spreading faster than the medici servitors could track. Vance looked at his hands. They were shaking. He needed Amasec, but he had rationed the last bottle for his commissars to keep them steady. If the line broke today, the hive would fall. If the hive fell, the sector would lose its primary manufactorum for promethium refinement. The consequences would ripple out for 100 light years. Tanks on distant fronts would stop. Ships would drift in the void. The Imperium would bleed. Vance knew this. The Black Legion knew this. That was why they were here. They were not just killing people. They were killing the future logistics of the segmentum. The sensors screamed at 0400 hours. It was not an orbital bombardment. The tech priest in the corner of the bunker began to chant in binary code. His mecha dendrites twitched in spasms of fear. The cogitators read an energy spike that did not match any known profile. It was not the corruption of the warp. It was not the green lightning of the Necrons. It was not the bioplasma of the Tyranids. It was a puncture wound in reality itself. The tech priest reported that the values were impossible. The energy signature felt old. It felt stable. It felt like the universe was trying to correct a mistake. A single object fell from the upper atmosphere. It did not burn up on re-entry. It moved with intent. It crashed into the no-man's land between the loyalist trenches and the traitor siege lines. The impact shook the bunker. Dust fell from the ceiling. Vance ordered the picked feeds to focus on the crash site. The crater was smoking. The dust settled slowly. In the center of the devastation stood 2 figures. They looked human, yet they were not. One was a male of significant size, though not as bulky as an Astartes. He wore blue armor that looked like a flag from a forgotten history. He carried a circular shield that the cogitators could not analyze. The metal of the shield absorbed the light around it. The second figure was a female. She stood tall, with hair like black wire and armor that gleamed with the color of gold and blood. She carried a sword and a coil of glowing rope. They stood back to back. They did not look afraid. They looked at the charging horde of cultists and traitor marines approaching them. They looked ready. The tech priest made the sign of the cog. He claimed they were unsanctioned biological variables. He claimed they were an error. Vance watched the screen. He saw the male figure adjust his shield. He saw the female figure raise her sword. The first wave of the Black Legion, a squad of Khorne berserkers screaming for blood, rushed toward the crater. The 2 strangers did not run. They did not seek cover. They stepped forward. Vance recorded the moment in the archives. He marked the time. This was the moment the logic of the war broke. This was the moment the impossible entered the equation. The archives would later call this the arrival of the outliers. At the time, Vance just called it the end of the world as he knew it. He waited to see them die. He was wrong. The history of the Antian sector pivoted on the dust of that crater. The dust of the impact crater had not yet settled when the first chainaxe screamed. The noise was a mechanical shriek, a sound of jagged teeth tearing at the air. The cornate berserker who wielded it was a towering construct of ceramite and hate, his armor the color of dried blood, edged in brass that seemed to weep oil. He covered the 50 meters between the trench line and the crater in 4 seconds. This was a speed that defied the mass of the power armor. It was a speed that usually froze the minds of mortal men, locking them in a paralysis of terror before the killing blow landed. The figure in blue did not freeze. The man known in another reality as Steve Rogers shifted his weight. He did not know where he was. He did not know why the sky was purple or why the air tasted of sulfur and dead iron. He only knew that a giant was charging him with a weapon designed to shred flesh. His muscle memory, honed in the fires of a simpler war and refined in the battles of an age of heroes, took over. He stepped into the charge. This was a tactical anomaly. Usually, prey ran away. Rogers brought the circular shield up. The alloy was Vibranium, a metal unknown to the tech priests of Mars, a singular geological accident from a world far away. The chainaxe descended with enough force to cleave a Lehman Russ battle tank's turret. The impact made no sound of crumpling metal. There was only a ringing bell-like tone that cut through the roar of the battlefield. The berserker stopped. The kinetic energy of the blow had been absorbed completely by the shield, redirected into a shockwave that blew the dust away from Rogers' boots. The Chaos Space Marine paused. His helm, fashioned into a skull-faced grimace, twitched. This violated the physics of combat he had known for 10,000 years. Rogers did not hesitate. He punched forward with the edge of the shield. He struck the berserker in the gorget, the neck joint where the armor was thinnest. The blow was perfect. It crushed the vocal emitter and the windpipe beneath. The giant staggered back, gargling blood. Behind Rogers, the woman moved. Diana of Themyscira did not fight like a soldier. She fought like a myth. She saw the squad of traitor Marines following the first berserker. There were 5 of them. They raised bolters, weapons that fired mass-reactive explosive shells. She recognized the threat of a projectile weapon instantly. She moved faster than the eye could track. To the watching Imperial Guardsmen in the distant trenches, she was a blur of gold and red. She deflected the first volley with her bracelets. The metal was divine, forged by gods, and the bolt shells detonated against them in sprays of shrapnel that did not scratch her skin. She closed the distance. Her sword was drawn. It was a blade that could slice atoms. She did not hack. She flowed. The first traitor Marine lost his arm at the shoulder before his brain registered the movement. The second tried to club her with his bolter. She slid under his guard and severed his leg at the knee. The battlefield fell into a stunned, violent rhythm. Rogers and Diana stood back to back in the center of the crater, surrounded by 6 transhuman killing machines. Rogers shouted a command. He told them to stand down. He tried to offer a surrender. The concept was alien to the Black Legion. The berserker he had throat-punched recovered, his physiology sealing the wound instantly. The giant roared, a wet, gurgling sound, and swung again. Rogers ducked. He swept the giant's legs with the edge of his shield. The Marine fell heavily. Rogers drove the shield edge down onto the Marine's helmet. Once, twice. The ceramite cracked. The skull beneath gave way. The giant stopped moving. Rogers looked up, breathing hard. He realized these were not men in suits. These were monsters fused with their gear. General Vance watched the feed in the bunker. The resolution was grainy, but the strategic cogitator was screaming error codes. The power levels of the two entities were fluctuating. The male was operating at peak human physical capacity, perhaps slightly beyond, but his equipment was registering invalid density values. The female was reading as an alpha-level biological threat. She had just kicked a Chaos Marine in the chest, and the Marine had flown backward 10 meters, cratering a ferrocrete wall. Vance looked at his commissar, a man named Holt. Holt's hand was hovering over his bolt pistol. His face was pale. He muttered about demons. He muttered about the tricks of the warp. Vance shook his head. Demons did not fight with tactical discipline. Demons reveled. These two were efficient. They were clearing a kill zone. On the field, the skirmish ended. The 6 Chaos Marines lay dead or dismembered. The silence that followed was heavy. The air was thick with the smoke of the bolt shells. Rogers scanned the horizon. He saw the trench lines of the Imperial Guard 300 meters away. He saw the Aquila banners, ragged and grey. He saw the terrified faces of men and women peering over the sandbags. He lowered his shield, but did not sheath it. He looked at Diana. Her sword was clean. The blood of the enemy sizzled and evaporated off the blade. She looked at the sky. She told him that the gods were not here. She said the air felt empty of light. She said she could smell an ancient rotting anger. Rogers nodded. He pointed to the trenches. He said they were the friendly lines. He said they looked like soldiers. He said they needed to move before the enemy brought up heavy weapons. They began to walk toward the Imperial lines. They did not run. They walked with hands visible, weapons held in a neutral posture. This was a mistake. In the 41st millennium, nothing approached a trench line unannounced and lived. A heavy bolter team in the center of the Imperial line panicked. The loader screamed that they were witches. The gunner squeezed the trigger. The weapon thumped, a rhythmic bass drum of death. High-caliber explosive rounds tore up the mud toward the two strangers. Rogers was there instantly. He tackled Diana, covering them both with the shield. The rounds hammered against the vibranium. The noise was deafening. The mud erupted around them. Rogers held his ground, digging his boots into the sludge. He did not return fire. He shouted for them to cease fire. His voice was amplified by command authority, a tone that demanded obedience. The gunner stopped, not because he wanted to, but because his weapon jammed. The machine spirit of the heavy bolter, perhaps sensing the anomaly of the shield, refused to cycle the next round. In the silence, Rogers stood up. He held his hands up high. He left the shield attached to his arm but open. He shouted that they were not enemies. He shouted that they were human. He asked for the commanding officer. In the trench, Commissar Holt climbed up the ladder. He stood on the parapet. His greatcoat whipped in the toxic wind. He leveled his bolt pistol at Rogers. He projected his voice. He demanded to know by whose authority they breathed. He demanded to know which dark power had spat them out. He accused them of being warp spawns. Rogers looked at the man. He saw the skull insignia on the hat. He saw the rigid posture. He saw the fear masked as aggression. Rogers replied that he was Captain Steve Rogers of the United States Army. He said he did not know where he was, but he had just fought the men who were trying to kill the trench soldiers. He asked for a status report. The words meant nothing to Commissar Holt. United States Army was a collection of nonsense syllables, but the tone was familiar. It was the tone of a high-ranking officer. It confused the commissar for a split second. In that second, the enemy artillery opened fire. The Black Legion had stopped playing. From the ridge lines 5 kilometers away, The basilisk batteries and defilers launched a saturation bombardment. They targeted the crater and the trench line simultaneously. The sky whistled. Rogers knew the sound. He grabbed Diana's arm. He pointed to the trench. They ran. They covered the 300 meters in seconds, moving faster than the incoming shells. They dove into the Imperial trench just as the world disintegrated. The earth heaved. Men screamed. The shockwave turned the mud into a liquid slurry. Rogers found himself buried under a pile of sandbags and a terrified guardsman. He shoved the debris aside. He checked the soldier. The boy was no older than 18. He was shaking, clutching a laser gun that looked like a toy. Rogers checked him for wounds. The boy stared at the star on Rogers's chest. He whispered a prayer to the God Emperor. Diana stood up in the trench. The artillery was still falling. She looked at the trajectory of the shells. She saw the distant ridge. She calculated the arc. She looked at the soldiers huddled in the mud, praying for death or salvation. Her eyes narrowed. She despised the passivity. She despised the fear. She climbed out of the trench. Rogers shouted her name. She did not stop. She stood on the lip of the trench, fully exposed. She crossed her bracelets. A shell landed 10 meters away. The blast wave washed over her. She did not move. She glowed with a soft, golden light. It was not the psychic light of the warp. It was the light of truth. She looked at the ridge and threw her lasso. The golden rope extended, defying physics, stretching hundreds of meters, glowing brighter. It did not reach the artillery, but it acted as a beacon. She slammed the handle of her sword against her shield. She challenged the enemy. She drew their fire. The Chaos forces obliged. The bombardment shifted. The shells began to target her specifically. She moved through the explosions, a dancer in a field of fire. This bought the trench time. Rogers saw the opportunity. He grabbed the commissar by the lapels of his coat. He told him to get his men up. He told him to sound the rally. The commissar looked at Rogers. He saw a man who should be dead. He saw a man giving orders with the absolute moral certainty of a primar. The commissar faltered. The dogma in his head said to shoot the mutant. The survival instinct in his gut said to obey the soldier. The commissar blew his whistle. He kicked the nearest guardsman. He ordered them to stand to. The respite lasted 10 minutes. Then the ground began to shake with a rhythmic thudding. It was not artillery. It was footsteps. From the smoke of the bombardment emerged a hell brute. The twisted dreadnought was a mass of flesh and metal, insane and crying out in binary agony. Its multi-melter cannon glowed white-hot. It was supported by a fresh wave of cultists, hundreds of them, chanting in a language that made the ears bleed. They were rushing the trench. Rogers looked at the line of guardsmen. Their laser guns were dirty. Their morale was broken. They were out of ammo. They were going to die. Rogers jumped out of the trench to join Diana. He landed beside her. He adjusted his shield. He looked at the charging horde. He asked her if she was ready. She smiled, a sad, grim smile. She said she was always ready. The Hellbrute fired. The beam of superheated melter energy hit Rogers' shield. The beam would have vaporized the bunker. Against the shield, it hissed and scattered. The heat was intense. Rogers grit his teeth. His boots slid backward in the mud. He held the line. He deflected the beam upward, slicing through a low-hanging cloud of smoke. The Hellbrute roared and charged. The collision was seismic. The Hellbrute weighed 12 tons. Rogers weighed 240 pounds. He dropped his shoulder and slammed the shield edge into the Hellbrute's knee joint. It was a precise application of leverage. The joint, stressed by centuries of corruption and rust, snapped. The machine beast stumbled. Diana was there. She leapt onto the Hellbrute's sarcophagus. She drove her sword down through the viewing slit. She found the pilot's remains inside. The machine went into a spasm and collapsed. The cultists did not stop. They threw themselves at the two heroes. It became a brawl. Rogers used his shield to bludgeon. He punched and kicked. He did not kill if he could avoid it. But these enemies did not stop when hit. They clawed at his eyes. They bit at his armor. He realized they were not sane. He realized they were rabid. He began to hit harder. Bones broke. Skull shattered. Diana used her lasso. The golden rope ensnared a dozen cultists. The magic of the lasso interacted with the corruption in their souls. They did not just be bound. They screamed as the light of the lasso burned away the warp taint. For many, the shock of clarity, the sudden realization of what they had become, killed them instantly. Their hearts stopped from the sheer horror of their own existence. The lasso was not just a weapon. It was a judge. The guardsmen in the trench watched this. They saw the golden light burning the heretics. One of them, a sergeant with a scarred face, whispered that it was the Emperor's light. The rumor spread down the line. It was not logic. It was desperate faith. They began to fire their laser guns again. They added their meager weight to the fight. The wave was broken. The cultists fled or died. The Hellbrute lay smoking. Rogers and Diana stood amidst the carnage. They were covered in gore, none of it their own. Rogers wiped his shield on a dead cultist's robe. He was breathing heavy, but not from exhaustion. He was processing the horror. He had seen war. He had seen the Chitauri. He had seen Ultron. But this was different. The enemies here were not soldiers. They were broken things. And the good guys. He looked at the trench. The guardsmen were cheering, but it was a hollow, manic sound. They looked like skeletons wrapped in flak armor. A Valkyrie dropship screamed overhead, its engines vectoring for a landing behind the trench lines. It bore the insignia of the Inquisition. It landed with a heavy thud. The ramp lowered. A squad of stormtroopers descended, their hell guns held high. They did not aim at the enemy. They aimed at Rogers and Diana. Behind them walked a figure in power armor, but lighter than the Astartes. It was an Inquisitor, Lord Inquisitor Valerius. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a cloak of velvet. He carried a force staff that crackled with psychic frost. He walked through the mud, ignoring the guardsmen who knelt in the filth as he passed. He stopped 10 meters from Rogers and Diana. Valerius studied them. His eyes were bionic, whirring as they zoomed and focused. He scanned their gear. He sensed their souls. He was a psyker of considerable power. He reached out with his mind to probe them. He hit a wall. Rogers' mind was disciplined, a fortress of will, but human. Diana's mind was blinding. It was like staring into a star. Valerius recoiled physically. He grimaced. He knew instantly that these were not creations of the warp. The warp felt like oil and sickness. These two felt like cold water and solid stone. But that made them no less dangerous. In the Imperium, different was synonymous with heretical. Rogers stepped forward. He holstered the shield on his back. He extended a hand. He introduced himself again. He asked for the person in charge. Valerius looked at the hand. He did not take it. He spoke with a voice that sounded like grinding stones. He told Rogers that he was standing on the soil of the God Emperor. He told Rogers that by the laws of the Ordo Hereticus, they should be burned where they stood. He asked why he should not give the order to his stormtroopers to open fire. Diana answered. She stepped in front of Rogers. She sheathed her sword. She looked Valerius in the eye. She told him that he could try, but he would lose his men, and the enemy on the ridge would overrun his position while he wasted time fighting his allies. She spoke with the authority of a queen. She told him that they had saved the trench. She pointed to the dead Hellbrute. She said they fought for the innocent. She asked if he did the same. Valerius paused. He was a pragmatist. He saw the Hellbrute. He saw the dead Chaos Marines. He knew his forces were stretched thin. Orestes' fief was falling. He needed weapons. He did not trust them. He suspected they were some form of archaeotech constructs or Xenos trickery. But they killed heretics. And right now, the Imperium needed things that killed heretics. He lowered his staff. He signaled his stormtroopers to lower their weapons, but not to holster them. He told Rogers and Diana that they were now conscripted into the service of the Holy Ordos. He told them they would be transported to the Hive City Command. He told them that if they made one move that smelled of treachery, he would have the planet exterminated from orbit to kill them. Rogers looked at Valerius. He heard the threat of genocide in the man's voice. He realized that the good guys here were willing to kill a planet to stop a threat. He realized the scale of the nightmare he had landed in. He looked at Diana. They shared a silent communication. They would play along. They would find out what was happening. Then they would fix it. Rogers nodded to Valerius. He said they would come. They boarded the Valkyrie. The interior was cramped and smelled of incense and old sweat. The ramp closed, sealing them in darkness. The engines roared. As the ship lifted off, Rogers looked out the viewport. He saw the battlefield from the air. It stretched for miles. Trenches, craters, bodies. A landscape of total war. He saw the Hive City in the distance, a mountain of metal piercing the clouds, surrounded by smoke. It looked like a tombstone. In the bunker, General Vance watched them leave. He poured the last of the amasec into a glass. He drank it in one swallow. The tech priest approached him. The priest held a data slate. The priest said that the metal of the shield had registered a resonance frequency that matched nothing in the archives. But the priest said something else. He said that when the female entity had glowed, the radiation sensors in the bunker had dropped. The background radiation of the planet, the fallout from the nuclear winter, had decreased by 0.01% in her vicinity. It was a micro-miracle. The priest asked if they were angels. Vance looked at the empty glass. He said he didn't care what they were. He said he just hoped they were on the Emperor's side. Because if they weren't, the war was already over. The Valkyrie flew toward the hive. Inside, Rogers tried to talk to the stormtroopers. He asked them about their unit. He asked them about the enemy. The stormtroopers did not answer. They stared straight ahead behind their gas masks. They were statues of obedience. Valerius sat opposite them, watching, his hand resting on a bolt pistol. The tension was absolute. Rogers leaned back. He checked his shield straps. He checked his belt. He was ready for the next fight. He knew it was coming. He did not know that the Black Legion had seen the footage too. He did not know that Abaddon the Despoiler, watching from the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit in high orbit, had just taken an interest. The War Master had seen the shield. He had seen the strength. He did not see heroes. He saw new trophies. He issued a command to the surface. The target priority had changed. The Hive City was secondary. The capture of the two anomalies was now primary. The drop pods began to cycle in the launch bays. The real war was about to begin. The Valkyrie transport touched down on the private landing pad of Spire Primus with a hydraulic hiss that sounded like a dying beast. The air at this altitude was thinner, filtered by atmospheric scrubbers that hummed with the vibration of 1,000 dying engines. Yet it still tasted of metallic ash and incense. Rogers unbuckled his restraints first. He looked at the stormtroopers opposite him. They had not moved a muscle during the flight. They sat like statues carved from grey stone. their hell guns resting across their chests. Rogers felt a chill that had nothing to do with the altitude. He was used to soldiers. He was used to discipline. But this was not discipline. This was the erasure of self. He looked at Diana. She was staring at the exit ramp, her face a mask of stone. She could feel the psychic weight of the city below them. It was a sensation of crushed souls, of billions of lives pressed together in the dark, screaming in silence. Inquisitor Valerius stood up. His velvet cloak did not flutter because the air here was stagnant, recycled for 10,000 years. He gestured for them to follow. The ramp lowered, revealing a sprawling plaza of black marble and gold. Statues of weeping saints lined the walkway, each one 10 meters tall, their faces twisted in expressions of ecstatic agony. Rogers stepped out and immediately noticed the servants. They were everywhere. They shuffled with a disjointed mechanical gait. He looked closer at a figure sweeping the dust near the landing gear. It was a man, or it had been. Half of his head was replaced by a brass optical unit. His arm was a vacuum attachment fused directly into the flesh of the shoulder. There were no eyes, only lenses. There was no mind, only a program loop. Rogers stopped. He pointed at the servitor. He asked Valerius what that was. Valerius did not even look. He said it was a servitor. He said it was a criminal or a heretic who had been repurposed for the glory of the Imperium. He said it was a mercy. Rogers looked at the lobotomized human. He saw the scars where the humanity had been cut away. He felt a surge of nausea. He had fought Nazis. He had fought Hydra. They killed people. They tortured people. But they did not turn people into appliances. Diana placed a hand on Rogers's shoulder. Her grip was tight. She whispered that they were walking into a graveyard of the living. She told him to stay focused. She told him that to save the prisoners, they first had to survive the jailers. They entered the Sanctum Governor. The doors were blast-proof adamantium, 3 meters thick, etched with wards against demons. Inside, the opulence was blinding. Chandeliers made of crystal and bone hung from ceilings lost in shadow. The walls were draped in tapestries depicting burning worlds and slaughter. It was a celebration of war. They were led to the Strategium, a cavernous room dominated by a hololith table the size of a tank. Around the table stood the masters of Orestes for 5. There was Governor Hax, a morbidly obese man floating in an anti-grav suspension harness, his skin pale and greasy. There was Lord General Vance, looking tired and grey. There was Canoness Viridian of the Order of the Ebon Chalice, her power armor gleaming white, her face scarred and zealous. Vance looked up as they entered. He nodded to Valerius. He looked at Rogers and Diana with a mixture of hope and suspicion. The hololith showed the hive city in wireframe blue. Red icons swarmed the perimeter. The walls were under assault. The icons showed breaches in the lower sectors. Vance was explaining a counterattack. He was suggesting sending the 8th and 9th Penal Legions into the radioactive sump waste to flank the enemy. He admitted the casualty rate would be 100%. He called it an acceptable expenditure of biomass. Roger stepped forward. He looked at the map. His tactical mind processed the terrain instantly. He saw the choke points. He saw the layout of the hive sectors. He interrupted the general. He said that throwing men into a radioactive wasteland was not a strategy. It was a massacre. He pointed to the transit hab blocks. He suggested falling back to the tertiary defense line, drawing the enemy into the narrow corridors of the manufactorum, and neutralizing their numbers with concentrated fire. He talked about preserving manpower. He talked about morale. The room went silent. Governor Hax laughed. It was a wet, wheezing sound. He asked who this primitive was. He asked why the primitive thought the life of a penal trooper mattered. Canoness Viridian looked at Rogers with cold contempt. She said that life was the Emperor's currency, and it was to be spent well. She said that retreat was a sin. She said that to give ground was to deny the Emperor's domain. She quoted scripture. She said it was better to die for the Emperor than to live for oneself. Diana spoke then. Her voice was not loud, but it silenced the room. She asked them if they worshipped death. She asked them if their Emperor wanted his people to die in the mud or to live and fight. She looked at the Canoness. She asked her where the honor was in suicide. The Canoness put her hand on the hilt of her power sword. She called Diana a witch. She said that only the faithful understood the necessity of sacrifice. Valerius stepped between them. He slammed his staff on the deck. Sparks of psychic frost scattered across the floor. He told them to cease. He said that Rogers and Diana were assets of the Inquisition, and their tactical data was to be considered, even if their philosophy was flawed. Vance rubbed his eyes. He looked at Rogers. He said that the Imperium did not have the luxury of retreat. He said the logistics of moving the civilian population from the outer Habs would take weeks. The bureaucracy required forms, stamps, authorization. Rogers stared at him. He realized the horror of the situation. It wasn't just the enemy outside. It was the system inside. The paperwork was more powerful than the logic of survival. Rogers slammed his fist on the table. He said to damn the paperwork. He said to open the bulkheads and let the people in. Before Vance could answer, the lights flickered. The hum of the ventilation system died. A low, thrumming vibration shook the floor. It was not an explosion. It was a resonance. The hololith table sparked and went dark. The tech priests in the corner began to scream in binary. They clawed at their own implants. Valerius spun around, his coat flaring. He shouted for a perimeter. He knew what was happening. It was not a bombardment. It was a teleport strike. The void shields of the spire prevented orbital bombardment, but they had been sabotaged from within to allow a micro-frequency gap, just enough for a localized warp jump. And the air in the center of the strategium tore open. It smelled of ozone and rotting meat. Black lightning crackled, arcing between the chandeliers and the floor. Reality groaned. From the tear, 5 figures materialized. They were massive. They wore Terminator armor, tactical dreadnought plate that made them look like walking tanks. The armor was black, trimmed with gold. On their shoulders was the Eye of Horus. These were the Ustarin, the elite of the Black Legion, the tip of Abaddon's spear. They did not roar. They did not scream. They raised their storm bolters and opened fire. The sound was deafening. The storm bolters fired mass reactive shells the size of soda cans. The governor's personal guard, men in carapace armor, disintegrated. They were turned into red mist and shrapnel in seconds. Governor Hax screamed as a stray round hit his suspension harness. The anti-grav failed. He fell to the floor, a helpless mass of flesh. The Terminator in the center carried a chain fist, a power fist with a built-in chainsaw. He revved it. The sound was a mechanical nightmare. He marched toward General Vance. Rogers moved. He did not think. He launched himself across the table. He raised his shield. He intercepted the stream of bolt shells aimed at the general. The impact was like being hit by a freight train. Rogers slid backwards, his boots gouging grooves in the marble floor. The vibranium hummed, absorbing the kinetic energy, but the sheer mass of the fire was overwhelming. He shouted for the others to get down. Diana was already moving. She did not defend. She attacked. She leapt over the table, her sword drawn. She targeted the Terminator on the left. The Chaos Marine raised a power axe to block. Diana's sword, the God-Killer, met the power field of the axe. There was a flash of white light. The power field shattered. The sword shore through the axe handle, through the ceramite pauldrons, and deep into the chest of the giant. The Terminator fell, but he did not die instantly. He backhanded Diana with a gauntlet that weighed as much as a motorcycle. Diana flew across the room and smashed into a stone pillar. The pillar cracked. Dust rained down. The remaining 4 Terminators adjusted their aim. They were professionals. They saw the threats. 2 suppressed Rogers with a wall of fire. 2 advanced on the Governor and the Canoness. Canoness Viridian drew her power sword. She charged the nearest Terminator, singing a hymn of battle. She was fast, a master of the blade, but she was fighting a monster that had warred for 10,000 years. The Terminator caught her sword in his power fist. The energy field flared. He crushed the blade. Then he punched her. The blow caught her in the chest plate. The ceramite crumpled. She was thrown backwards, sliding across the floor, blood coughing from her grill. Valerius unleashed his psychic power. He raised his staff and screamed a word of power. Lightning arced from his eyes. It struck the lead Terminator. The giant stumbled, his armor smoking, but he did not fall. The runes carved into his black plate glowed red, absorbing the psychic energy. He laughed, a deep bass sound that shook the walls. He raised his storm bolter at the Inquisitor. Rogers saw the angle. He could not reach Valerius in time. He threw his shield. The disc flew through the air, ricocheting off the floor, and struck the Terminator's weapon arm just as he fired. The aim was knocked wide. The shells blew a hole in the tapestry behind Valerius. The shield returned to Rogers' magnetic glove. He caught it and charged. He slammed into the Terminator's knees. It was like hitting a concrete wall. The Terminator looked down. He raised his foot to stomp Rogers into paste. Rogers rolled. He uppercut with the edge of the shield, driving it into the groin joint of the armor. The servo bundle snapped. The giant buckled. Diana recovered. She shook the dust from her hair. Her eyes were glowing with fury. She realized that these enemies were not just strong. They were anchors for something else. She could feel the warp bleeding off them. They were trying to complete a ritual. The Terminator standing over the Governor wasn't killing him yet. He was holding a device, a jagged spike of corrupt metal, and driving it into the floor. He was creating a beacon. "Steve!" Diana shouted. "The spike! Break the spike!" Rogers heard her. He didn't know what the spike was, but he trusted her. He disengaged from the kneeling Terminator. He sprinted toward the Governor. The Terminator with the chain fist turned to intercept him. Rogers slid on his knees, going under the swing of the buzzing saw. He came up right in front of the device. He smashed the edge of his shield into the spike. The metal rang, a discordant shriek that hurt the teeth. The spike bent, but it did not break. It was forged in the soul forges of the warp. The Terminator grabbed Rogers by the neck. The servo motors whined. Rogers grabbed the wrist of the gauntlet. He strained, his biceps bulging. He was strong, arguably the strongest human who had ever lived. But the Terminator was a gene-forged monster powered by unnatural energies. Rogers felt his windpipe compressing. He gasped for air. He looked the giant in the faceplate. He saw the red lenses. He saw no mercy. Diana slammed into the Terminator from the side. She hit him with the force of a falling building. The grip broke. Rogers fell to the floor, gasping. Diana and the Terminator traded blows. It was a blur of gold and black. The Terminator was slow, but every hit was a killing blow. Diana was fast, but her skin could bruise, her bones could break. She ducked a power fist and slashed the back of the knee. The Terminator roared. Suddenly the room went cold. Absolute zero. The spike in the floor pulsed. It hadn't been broken enough. A wave of shadow expanded from it. It passed through the governor. Hax convulsed. His eyes rolled back. He began to speak, but the voice was not his. It was a chorus of 1,000 screaming voices. The beacon was active. It wasn't just a location marker. It was a possession key. The governor of Orestes V was no longer human. He was a gateway. Valerius saw this. He made the hard choice, the imperial choice. He aimed his staff not at the Terminators, but at the governor. He fired a bolt of psychic fire. It hit Hax in the chest. The governor exploded in a shower of meat and corrupted light. The beacon, silence. The ritual was broken. But the cost was the leadership of the planet. The Terminators saw their objective failed. The leader, the one fighting Diana, issued a guttural command. They began to back away, firing as they went. They were not retreating out of fear. They were extracting. Their mission was a partial success. They had decapitated the command structure. They moved toward the tear in reality. Diana tried to pursue, but a wall of bolter fire forced her to cover up with her bracelets. The Terminators stepped backward into the rift. The darkness swallowed them. The tear sealed with a thunderclap that shattered every window in the sanctum. Silence returned to the room, broken only by the crackle of fires and the groans of the dying. Roger stood up. He rubbed his bruised throat. He looked around. The strategium was a ruin. The tactical map was dead. The governor was a wet stain on the floor. Canoness Viridian was being attended to by a hospitaller, her armor ruined, her breathing ragged. General Vance was staring at the spot where the governor had died. He looked broken. Valerius walked over to the remains of the governor. He looked at them with cold detachment. He turned to the room. He announced that he was assuming emergency command of the sector by inquisitorial decree. He looked at Rogers and Diana. There was no gratitude in his eyes, only calculation. He said they had performed adequately. Rogers walked up to Valerius. He pointed a finger at the Inquisitor's chest. He asked why he killed the man. He asked why he didn't try to save him. Valerius slapped the hand away. He told Rogers that the governor was already dead. He said he had become a vessel for the primordial annihilator. He said that if he had hesitated for 1 second, the entire spire would have become a demon gate, and millions would have lost their souls, not just their lives. He told Rogers that in this universe, mercy was a weakness that killed worlds. Rogers stepped back. He looked at Diana. She was wiping black ichor from her sword. She looked tired, not physically, but spiritually. She looked at Rogers and shook her head. She understood what Valerius meant, but she hated it. She hated the logic of the butcher. General Vance coughed. He limped toward the table. He tried to reactivate the hololith. It flickered to life, but the image was distorted. The red icons had multiplied. The confusion caused by the attack had paralyzed the defense grid. The outer walls of the hive were being overrun. The penal legions Vance had wanted to send were already dead, slaughtered in their barracks by cultist infiltrators who had risen up when the beacon pulsed. The massacre Rogers had predicted had happened, but not because of the attack he stopped. It happened because the enemy was everywhere. Rogers looked at the map. He saw the collapsing lines. He saw the civilian sectors flashing red. He asked Vance what the plan was now. Vance looked at Valerius. Valerius looked at the map. The Inquisitor said the plan was to seal the middle hive. He said they would detonate the transit bridges. They would cut off the lower hive. They would sacrifice the bottom 10 billion citizens to create a kill box for the upper hive. Rogers froze. He thought he misheard. He asked to repeat that. Valerius spoke slowly. He said they would seal the gates. The lower hive was lost. To fight there was to waste resources. They would quarantine the infection. Rogers looked at the map. He saw the sheer number of lights in the lower hive. Families, workers, children, 10 billion people. He looked at Valerius. He said no. He said they would not do that. He said they would go down there. They would lead the defense. They would hold the line so the people could evacuate up. Valerius laughed. It was a dry, humorless bark. He asked, evacuate where? There was no up. The upper hive was full. The ships were gone. There was nowhere to go. He said Rogers did not understand the arithmetic of the 41st millennium. He said he would give the order. Rogers moved. He placed his hand on the master console, covering the activation rune for the demolition charges. He looked Valerius in the eye. He said he was not asking. He said he was taking command of the ground defense. He said if Valerius tried to blow the bridges, he would have to go through him. The stormtroopers raised their weapons. The tension was a physical weight. Diana stepped up beside Rogers. She crossed her bracelets. She looked at the stormtroopers. She dared them to try. General Vance looked between them. He saw the Inquisitor, the symbol of absolute fear. He saw the captain, the symbol of impossible hope. Vance was an old man. He was going to die soon anyway. He made a choice. He put his hand on the console next to Rogers. He told the Inquisitor that the captain was right. He said that if they blew the bridges now, the panic would destroy the upper hive anyway. He said they needed to buy time. He said he would authorize the deployment of the captain to the lower hive. Valerius stared at Vance. He looked like he was about to execute the general, but he calculated the odds. If he fought Rogers and Diana here, he would lose his stormtroopers. He would lose the spire. He needed them to fight the enemy, not him. He sneered. He lowered his staff. He told Rogers to go. He told him to go into the dark. He said when the lower hive fell, and it would fall, the blood of every wasted soldier would be on Rogers' hands. He said he would wait to blow the bridges until the last possible moment. But not a second later. Rogers nodded. He didn't care about the threat. He cared about the chance. He looked at Diana. He said, let's go. They turned and left the Strategium. They headed for the turbo lifts that would take them down into the abyss of the underhive. As the doors closed, Valerius watched them on the security feed. He turned to his servo skull. He began to record a message. It was not to his superiors. It was to the Grey Knights. He requested a containment team. He stated that the assets known as Rogers and Diana were potentially compromised by their own morality. He stated that if they survived the battle, they would likely need to be purged. He marked the file with the rune of Exterminatus. The elevator descending rapidly. The lights strobed as they passed the levels. Rogers checked his shield. It was scratched and scorched. Diana checked her sword. It was sharp. They stood in silence. They were descending into a city that was a dungeon, to fight an army of nightmares, to save people who had been taught to hate them. Rogers took a breath. He adjusted his glove. He said he hadn't fought Terminators before. Diana looked at him. She said they were just men in metal shells. She said shells break. The elevator hit the bottom. The doors opened. The smell of the underhive hit them. It smelled of chemical fires and despair. The screaming was louder here. Rogers stepped out. He began to run. The descent into the underhive of Orestes V was not merely a change in elevation, but a regression in history. As the turbo lift rattled past the immense kilometers of hab blocks, the air grew heavy with the taste of recycled sweat and chemical runoff. Rogers stood by the grate of the lift, watching the lights of the upper spire fade into a toxic smog that hung like a ceiling over the abyss. He checked the ammunition counter on the bolt pistol he had liberated from a dead commissar's supply crate. It was heavy, brutal, and clumsy compared to the weapons of his time. But it fired. Diana stood opposite him, her eyes closed, listening to the psychic scream of the city. She could hear the distinct tonal shift here. Above, it was the cold ambition of the highborn and the rigid fear of the soldiers. Down here, it was a chaotic cacophony of desperation, hunger, and a feral, animalistic terror. They were descending into a cage where 10 billion human beings were waiting to die. The lift slammed into its magnetic clamps at the transit hub of Sector Primus Low. The doors ground open, revealing a cavernous space that looked more like a subterranean cathedral dedicated to rust than a transport station. Thousands of refugees were huddled in the gloom, illuminated by flickering lumens and burning barrels of promethium waste. The smell was physical, a wall of unwashed bodies and industrial rot. When Rogers stepped out, the crowd did not cheer. They recoiled. They saw the armor, the size, and the weapons, and they assumed he was a death squad sent to purge them to save oxygen. A woman near the front clutched a bundle of rags to her chest, her eyes wide with the learned hopelessness of the Imperial citizen. Rogers lowered his shield. He raised his hands. He took off his helmet, revealing a human face, sweating and concerned. He spoke into the silence. He did not speak of the Emperor or heresy. He asked who was in charge of the sector defense. A man pushed through the crowd. He wore the ragged flak armor of the Planetary Defensive Force, patched with scrap metal. He had a laser gun slung over his shoulder and a chainsword that looked like it hadn't been oiled in a decade. He was Sergeant Corgan, a veteran of 3 Underhive gang wars before he was conscripted. He looked at Rogers, then at the golden woman behind him. He spat a wad of low-stick residue on the deck. He said there was no defense. He said the nobles had sealed the bulkheads above. He said they were just waiting for the traitors to come down the freight elevators or breach the outer sump gates. He said they were dead men walking. Rogers looked at the sergeant. He looked at the layout of the hub. It was a natural choke point. Huge pillars of ferrocrete supported the ceiling. Narrow causeways led to the lower manufactories. Rogers began to issue orders. He did not ask for permission. He spoke with the natural frequency of command that bypassed fear and tapped directly into the soldier's instinct to survive. He told Corgan to establish a perimeter at the north gate. He told Diana to scout the ventilation shafts for infiltrators. He told the civilians to start moving scrap metal to the choke points to build barricades. Corgan stared at him. He asked why they should bother. He asked what difference it would make. Rogers looked the man in the eye. He said that as long as they drew breath, they had a job to do. He said they were not going to die on their knees. Corgan hesitated, then nodded. The logic of the soldier took over. It was better to do something than to wait for the butcher. The preparation time was less than an hour. The enemy did not wait. The Black Legion had deployed a warband of the lost and the damned, traitor guard regiments that had sworn loyalty to the Dark Gods, supported by a pack of raptors, Chaos Space Marines equipped with jump packs. They came from the southern freight tunnels, a screaming horde of filth-encrusted soldiers chanting praises to Nurgle, the Plague Father. They did not use tactics initially. They relied on terror. They drove a wave of plague zombies before them, shambling corpses of the previous sector's inhabitants, bloated with gas and disease. The smell hit the defenders before the enemy was visible. It was a stench of sweet rot that made the eyes water and the stomach turn. Rogers stood at the front of the barricade. He had organized the PDF into 3 firing lines. He held his shield ready. When the zombies came into view, the PDF wavered. The horror of seeing their neighbors and families turned into monsters was a potent weapon. A young trooper dropped his laser gun and began to weep. Rogers did not reprimand him. He stepped up to the barricade. He threw his shield. The vibranium disc flew in a flat arc, shearing through the heads of 3 zombies before ricocheting off a stanchion and returning to his hand. The violence was clean, precise, and devoid of fear. Rogers shouted, "Fire!" The command broke the spell. The PDF opened up. Laser guns flashed, a wall of red light. The zombies fell in heaps, their bloated bodies bursting in clouds of infectious spores. But the zombies were just the meat shield. Behind them, the traitor guard opened fire with heavy stubbers and grenade launchers. Explosions rocked the barricade. Rogers was everywhere. He was a blue blur in the smoke. He covered a heavy weapons team as they reloaded. He caught a frag grenade on his shield and smothered the blast. He grabbed a wounded medic and dragged him to cover. He was fighting a war of attrition, and he knew the math was bad. The PDF had limited power packs. The enemy had the infinite resources of chaos. Diana was fighting her own war in the rafters. The Raptors had entered the high ceiling space, intending to drop down behind the barricades and slaughter the civilians. They were predators, their armor warped into bird-like shapes, their jump packs screaming like tortured souls. Diana met them in the air. She did not fly like they did. She leaped, using the girders and chains as fulcrums. She was faster than their sensors could track. She intercepted the leader, a Night Lord in midnight blue armor, as he dove toward the command post. She caught him by the jump pack intake. She tore the engine free with a screech of tearing metal. The Marine fell, flailing, to be crushed on the deck below. She used her lasso to snag another, spinning him around to use his own bolt of fire to rake his squad mates. She was a golden storm in the darkness, a beacon that the terrified refugees looked up to with awe. They began to pray, not the rote prayers of the ecclesiarchy, but desperate personal prayers to the Angel of Gold. The battle raged for 6 hours. The transit hub became a slaughterhouse. The floor was slick with blood and promethium. Rogers was exhausted. His armor was scored by las fire. His arm ached from the impacts against the shield. But the line held. The traitor guard pulled back, leaving mounds of dead. A cheer went up from the PDF. It was a ragged, hoarse sound, but it was a cheer. Corgan walked up to Rogers. He offered him a canteen of recycled water. He said he had never seen anything like that. He said the captain fought like a Primarch. Rogers took the water. He didn't know what a Primarch was. He just knew that they had bought time, but the cost was high. 300 PDF were dead. 1,000 civilians had been killed by stray fire or the toxic gas grenades. Rogers walked through the makeshift medical bay. It was a vision of hell. The Medicare supplies were non-existent. Men were binding wounds with dirty rags. Infection was already setting in. A woman was holding a child who had been exposed to a chem cloud. The child's skin was blistering. Rogers knelt beside them. He used a strip of cloth from his own uniform to clean the wound. He looked at the woman. She looked at him with hollow eyes. She asked if the Emperor had sent him. Rogers didn't lie. He said he came to help. He said he wouldn't leave. The woman touched the star on his chest. She died 10 minutes later from internal hemorrhaging. Rogers stood up. His hands were shaking. This wasn't just war. This was neglect on an industrial scale. The Imperium had failed these people long before the Chaos Marines arrived. Diana landed beside him. Her armor was pristine, the dirt and blood sliding off the magical metal, but her face was grim. She told Rogers that the enemy was regrouping. She had seen their movements from the high ground. They were not just attacking, they were herding. They were driving the population of the surrounding sectors toward the hub. They were concentrating the biomass. Rogers looked at the tactical map Corgan had sketched on a crate. He realized the trap. The Black Legion didn't want to take the hub. They wanted to fill it. They were creating a mass sacrifice. If enough people died in terror in one place, the veil between reality and the warp would thin. They were trying to summon a greater demon. Rogers called a war council. Corgan and 2 other PDF lieutenants gathered. Rogers explained the situation. He said they couldn't stay here. If they stayed, they would be sacrificed. They had to move. He pointed to the map, to a large pumping station 5 kilometers deeper in the sump. It was the primary water purification plant for the lower hive. It was a fortress of thick pipes and plasteel. It was defensible. And more importantly, if they controlled it, they controlled the water. The enemy needed water too. Corgan shook his head. He said the route to the pumping station was through the rust gardens, a maze of derelict machinery and toxic swamps. He said it was suicide to move 100,000 civilians through there. Rogers said it was suicide to stay. He said they would form a moving phalanx. The PDF on the outside, civilians in the middle. He and Diana would take the rear guard. They would move now, before the enemy finished their ritual preparations. The migration began. It was a biblical exodus through a metallic hell. The column of refugees stretched for miles. Rogers walked at the back, the most dangerous position. He carried a crippled girl on one shoulder and his shield on the other arm. He kept the pace slow, steady. He talked to the people. He asked their names. He told them to keep moving. He was a shepherd of the damned. The humanity thread of the narrative tightened here. The rations ran out on the 2nd day of the march. People began to eat the fungus, scraping off the pipes. They drank the grey water dripping from the ceiling. Dysentery spread. Rogers saw men lie down and refuse to get up. He didn't yell at them. He picked them up. He carried their gear. He led by an example that was so physically impossible that it shamed the others into moving. The Black Legion harried them the whole way. Sniper fire from the shadows. Booby traps in the piles of scrap. Diana was constantly moving, hunting the hunters. She found a squad of Alpha Legion infiltrators disguised as refugees. They had been sowing discord, whispering that Rogers was leading them to a death camp. Diana did not give them a trial. She used her lasso to compel the truth from them in front of the crowd. They confessed their allegiance to the ruinous powers. The mob tore them apart with their bare hands. It was a savage justice that unsettled Rogers, but he said nothing. The rules of engagement had changed. They reached the pumping station on the 3rd day. It was a massive citadel of brass and iron, built into the side of a geothermal vent. The gates were sealed. The local Mechanicus adepts inside refused to open. They broadcast a message that they were under quarantine protocols and would incinerate anyone who approached. Corgan looked at Rogers. He raised his laser gun. He said they would have to storm it. Rogers lowered the gun. He said they weren't going to kill the people they were trying to save. Rogers walked up to the main gate alone. A servitor gun turret tracked him. The voice of a tech priest blared from a speaker, citing binary code and warnings of lethal force. Rogers spoke to the camera. He identified himself. He gave a full tactical report of the enemy pursuing them. He spoke not of mercy, but of logic. He argued that the biomass of the refugees was a resource the Imperium could not afford to lose. He argued that if the Black Legion took the refugees, they would summon a demon that would consume the pumping station regardless of the blast doors. He appealed to the machine logic of the preservation of the facility. There was a long silence. The logic held. The tech priest, a Magos biologist named X99, calculated the probabilities. The probability of survival remained at 0% if the demon was summoned. The probability rose to 12% if the captain entity assisted in the defense. The gates ground open. The refugees poured inside, collapsing on the cool metal floors. The respite was short. The Black Legion arrived in force. This time they brought the heavy hitters. A Chaos Sorcerer of the Thousand Suns, a towering figure in blue and gold armor surrounded by a halo of warp fire, levitated over the battlefield. He was leading a contingent of rubric marines, automata animated by dust and sorcery. They marched in perfect unison, their inferno bolters firing warp flame that burned the soul as well as the flesh. The battle for the pumping station was the strategic pivot of the act. The sorcerer, whose name was Ahriman's disciple, Kinathos, did not care about the station. He wanted the anomalies. He sensed the unique temporal signature of Rogers and the divine resonance of Diana. He wanted to harvest them. He began a ritual, using the geothermal vents to amplify his psychic reach. He turned the steam of the station into a toxic fog that induced hallucinations. Inside the station, the defenders were breaking. Men were screaming, clawing at their eyes, seeing their worst nightmares. Corgan fell to his knees, aiming his weapon at his own men, seeing them as monsters. Rogers felt the fog clawing at his mind. He saw Bucky falling from the train. He saw Peggy in the hospital bed. He saw the ashes of New York. He shook his head. His will was a fortress. He slammed his shield against a pipe, the ringing sound cutting through the psychic noise. He shouted orders, grounding the men in reality. Eyes front. Check your targets. It's an illusion. Diana felt the magic. It was old, bitter magic. She recognized the flavor of Tzinch, the changer of ways. She knew she couldn't fight this with the sword. She sheathed her blade. She uncoiled the lasso. She wasn't going to bind a person. She was going to bind the lie. She spun the rope, creating a vortex of golden light. She lashed out, not at the sorcerer, but at the fog itself. The lasso of Hestia burned with the fires of truth. It caught the psychic construct and pulled. The fog unraveled. The hallucinations shattered. Corgan gasped, lowering his weapon. The rubric marines paused, their connection to the sorcerer disrupted. Rogers saw the opening. He signaled the counterattack, but he didn't order a charge. He ordered the tech priest X-99 to vent the superheated coolant from the main reactor into the plaza where the Chaos forces stood. The Magos hesitated. That would reduce the station's efficiency by 40%. Rogers shouted that there would be no station if they didn't do it. The Magos complied. Massive vents opened. A river of white-hot steam and chemical coolant blasted out. The rubric marines, immune to pain but not physics, were knocked back, their armor joints seizing from the thermal shock. The sorcerer, Kinathos, roared in annoyance, his concentration broken. Rogers and Diana advanced through the steam. They moved as a team. Rogers blocked the bolt fire, the impact staggering him but never stopping him. Diana used his shield as a launch pad, vaulting over the rubricae to strike at the sorcerer. Kinathos unleashed a bolt of doombolt lightning. Diana crossed her bracelets. The impact blew a crater in the ferrocrete, but she held. She deflected the energy back at him. Kinathos raised a psychic barrier. Rogers was there. He didn't attack the sorcerer magically. He threw a frag grenade at the sorcerer's feet, then shield bashed the sorcerer's staff. It was a combination of high fantasy and gritty trench warfare. The grenade distracted. The shield strike unbalanced. Kinathos fell back. He looked at these two mortals who defied the logic of the warp. He realized this was a fight he couldn't win quickly, and his ritual was ruined. The Black Legion commander, seeing the sorcerer fail, ordered a retreat. They had tested the defenders and found them too hard a nut to crack for a mere raiding party. They pulled back to the shadows. The battle ended not with a cheer, but with a collective collapse. The pumping station was secure. The water was safe. But the cost was tallying up. Rogers walked the perimeter. The PDF had lost another 40% of their effective strength. The ammunition was almost gone. The civilians were starving. In the command center, a Vox channel opened. It was Inquisitor Valerius from the High Spire. The connection was static-filled. Valerius sounded impressed, which was a terrifying tone. He admitted that the cogitators had predicted Rogers's death within 4 hours. He stated that Rogers's survival had drawn 3 companies of traitor Marines away from the Upper Spire assaults. The strategic pressure on the governor's palace had lessened. Rogers demanded extraction. He said they had 100,000 civilians in the water supply. He demanded food and transport. Valerius laughed, a sound like dry paper tearing. He told Rogers that there was no transport. The Upper Spire was under siege. The elevators were cut. Rogers had done exactly what the Imperium needed. He had created a second front that absorbed the enemy's attention. He had turned the Underhive into a meat grinder that was consuming the Black Legion's resources. Valerius said he would send drop pods with ammunition. He would send rations, but he would not send rescue. Rogers was to hold the pumping station. He was to make the enemy bleed for every inch. He was to be the anvil. Rogers stared at the Voxcaster. He realized the strategic chain reaction. By fighting so well, he had proved that the Underhive was a threat to the Chaos forces. The Black Legion would now have to turn their full attention to him to secure their rear. He hadn't saved the people. He had made them the primary target. He had escalated the conflict. Diana looked at him. She saw the weight settling on his shoulders. She touched his arm. She said they were alive. She said that was the only victory that mattered today. Rogers looked at the refugees huddled in the warmth of the reactor pipes. He looked at Corgan, who was bandaging a stump where his hand used to be. Rogers nodded. He accepted the burden. He was Captain America. He could do this all day. But looking at the dark tunnel entrances, he wondered if the people could. The sound of drop pods crashing through the upper hive levels, bringing bullets and corpse starch bars, fueling the war machine for another day. In the shadows of the vents, the eyes of the underhive mutants watched, and deeper still, something ancient stirred. Woken by the taste of Diana's divine light, the Necrons in the deep tombs beneath the city had detected an energy signature that violated their celestial almanacs. They began to cycle up their reanimation protocols. The war was about to get much older and much colder. The siege of the pumping station, Beta Rho, entered its 9th day, with a silence that was worse than the shelling. The drop pods sent by Inquisitor Valerius had provided ammunition and crates of ration bars stamped with the Departamento Munitorum seal. The bars were tasteless blocks of reprocessed organic matter, colloquially known as corpse starch. Rogers sat on a crate of bolt shells, watching a group of children gnaw on the grey bricks. He knew what the food was made of. He had read the manifests. He had chosen not to tell the civilians. In this universe, ignorance was not just bliss. It was a caloric necessity. The station smelled of unwashed bodies, ozone, and the copper tang of fear. The refugees were safe from the immediate slaughter of the Black Legion, but they were dying slowly of despair. The humanity thread had frayed to a single strand. There was no laughter. There was no weeping anymore. There was only the dull lethargy of organisms waiting for the end. Rogers checked his shield. The pain was gone. The star on his chest was scorched black. He looked at Diana. She was sitting cross-legged near the reactor core, her sword across her knees. She was meditating, but her brow was furrowed. The psychic pressure of the warp was constant here, a background radiation of malice that tried to whisper in their ears whenever they closed their eyes. She opened them as Rogers approached. She told him that the silence outside was artificial. She said the enemy was not sleeping. She said they were waiting for something. Rogers agreed. His tactical sense, honed in the Ardennes and refined against Hydra, told him that the Black Legion's pause was a preparation for a killing blow. They were not leaving. They were gathering. The choice that changed the history of the sector began with a minor reading on a cogitator. Tech Priest X-99, a being more brass than biology, approached Rogers with a datapad. The priest's vocal synthesizer clicked as he reported a thermal anomaly. It was not in the enemy lines. It was not in the ventilation shafts. It was below them. The station was built on top of ancient geothermal vents that powered the pumps. But the readings showed a spike in energy that did not match magma flow. It was rhythmic. It was structured. X-99 hypothesized a sabotage attempt by the Alpha Legion, perhaps a melter charge drilled deep into the foundation to collapse the station into the magma below. Rogers looked at the schematic. If the foundation cracked, the station would fall, and everyone would burn. It was a threat that had to be neutralized. He made the decision. It was the small choice. He ordered a reconnaissance sweep. He would go himself, taking Diana and a squad of Korgan's best tunnel fighters. They would descend into the service sublevels, identify the heat source, and neutralize the saboteurs. It was a standard security sweep. It was the logical, responsible action of a commander securing his perimeter. In any other war, it would have been a footnote. In the 41st millennium, it was the key that unlocked a tomb. The team descended through the maintenance shafts. The air grew hotter. The familiar rust of the Imperial architecture began to change. The rivets and bolted plates gave way to smooth, seamless tunnels of black stone. The stone was cold to the touch despite the ambient heat. It seemed to absorb the light from their lumen lamps. Korgan shifted his lasgun nervously. He whispered that this didn't look like Imperial stonework. He said it looked like the xenotech rumors the veterans whispered about in the mess halls. Rogers told him to stay sharp. He felt an unease that had nothing to do with the heat. The silence here was different. It was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum. They reached the source of the heat. It was a massive chamber, a kilometer wide, buried beneath the crust of the planet. It was not a cave. It was a hall. Rows of obsidian pillars stretched into the darkness. In the center of the room stood a monolith of glowing green crystal. The heat was radiating from it, a pulse of energy that felt like the heartbeat of a sleeping god. But it was not just a power source. It was a lock. Around the monolith stood statues. They were skeletal figures made of living metal, holding long, fluted rifles. They were motionless. Dust lay thick on their shoulders. They looked like decorations in a crypt. Rogers signaled for the squad to hold fire. He approached the monolith. He saw no Alpha Legionnaires. He saw no bombs. He saw glyphs etched into the black stone that his eyes could not track. They seemed to shift when he looked away. X-99, who had accompanied them, began to twitch. The tech priest's sensors were screaming. He warned Rogers that the energy signature was not thermal. It was temporal. The crystal was manipulating the flow of time around it to preserve the stasis of the complex. The heat was a byproduct of entropy being bled off. Diana walked up to the nearest statue. She looked at the metal skull. She said there was no soul inside. She said it was an empty vessel. She reached out to touch it. At that moment, the small choice cascaded into catastrophe. The proximity of Diana's divine aura, the sheer potency of her truth light, interacted with the stasis field. The crystal reacted to the foreign energy source. It did not see a bomb. It saw an intruder. It saw a rival god signature. The monolith turned from green to a blinding orange. A klaxon sounded, a discordant electronic shriek that bypassed the ears and vibrated the bones. The statues did not move like machines starting up. They moved with instant, fluid acceleration. The green lights in their eyes ignited. The Necrons of the Zarikhan dynasty had awoken. The first warrior raised its Gauss flare and fired. The beam of green energy hit one of Korgan's men. There was no explosion. The trooper simply ceased to exist. His armor, his flesh, his bones were stripped away layer by layer in a millisecond, flayed into atoms. He didn't even have time to scream. The silence of the tomb was broken by the hum of molecular disintegration. Rogers shouted, "Contact!" He brought his shield up just as 3 beams converged on him. The vibranium rang with a pitch he had never heard before. The metal held, but the impact pushed him back, his boots sliding on the obsidian floor. He realized instantly that this was superior technology. This wasn't the crude explosive force of the bolter or the erratic energy of the warp. This was physics weaponized by a species that had killed their own gods. Diana drew the godkiller. She lunged at the nearest warrior. Her sword sliced through the necrodermis, but the metal began to flow back together as soon as the blade passed. The wound healed in seconds. The Necron turned its head, a slow mechanical rotation, and backhanded her. The blow was heavy, like being hit by a wrecking ball. She rolled with the impact and came up slashing. She severed the head. The body collapsed, but the head continued to chatter, its eyes glowing. "Retreat," Rogers ordered. "Fall back to the shaft." They fired as they ran. The lust bolts of the PDF splashed harmlessly against the living metal of the Necrons. Korgan threw a frag grenade. It detonated against a phalanx of warriors. When the smoke cleared, they were still walking. They were relentless. They did not run. They did not shout. They marched with the inevitability of death itself. More lights were waking up in the darkness, thousands of them. The small choice to investigate the heat had triggered the reanimation protocols for the entire Tomb World complex beneath Orestes 5-5. They scrambled up the maintenance shaft, sealing the bulkheads behind them. Rogers could hear the Necrons cutting through the blast doors below. It sounded like a welding torch cutting through butter. They burst back into the pumping station, breathless and terrified. Rogers grabbed X-99. He told the priest to seal the lower levels. He told him to weld the vents shut. X-99 was shaking. He said it was impossible to stop them. He identified them as the Necrons. He said they were the end of all things. He said the machine god had abandoned them. Rogers slapped the metal faceplate of the priest. He told him to focus. He told him to do his job. The alarm sirens of the station began to wail, but it wasn't for the Necrons. The tactical display on the upper levels lit up. The Black Legion had launched their assault. They had timed it perfectly, or perhaps the Chaos Sorcerers had sensed the disturbance below and seized the moment. The station was now the meat in a sandwich. The Black Legion was hammering on the front gates, and the Necrons were burning their way up through the floor. The massive outcome began to unfold. The battle for Pumping Station Betero became a 3-way chaotic melee. The Black Legion breached the main airlock. A Mauler Fiend, a demon engine of brass and muscle, tore through the barricades, crushing refugees under its hooves. The PDF opened fire, desperate and screaming. At the same time, the floor in the center of the plaza melted. Green beams of light shot up from the darkness, vaporizing the Mauler Fiend in mid-charge. The beast screamed as it was atomized. The Chaos Marines paused. They had expected scared humans. They found the ancient enemy. A phalanx of Necron immortals rose from the pit. They formed a firing line. They did not care about the humans. They targeted the Chaos Space Marines. To the Necrons, the warp-tainted creatures were an infestation, a violation of the orderly galaxy they sought to reclaim. They opened fire. The heavy bolter fire of the Black Legion exploded against the Necron shields. The Gauss blasters returned fire, stripping the ceramite armor from the traitor Marines, revealing the mutated flesh beneath, and then stripping that too. Rogers saw the chaos. He saw the opportunity and the horror. The refugees were caught in the crossfire. Green beams and explosive bolts were flying everywhere. He grabbed Diana. He told her they had to clear a path. He told her they couldn't hold the station. The strategic value of the water was gone. If they stayed, the Necrons would kill everyone to cleanse the station, or the Chaos Marines would kill everyone to offer them to the gods. The only option was escape. But escape to where? The tunnels were full of Necrons. The gates were blocked by chaos. Rogers looked at the map. There was a waste disposal chute that led to the toxic Sump Sea, a vast underground ocean of chemical runoff. It was dangerous, poisonous, and uncharted, but it was open. We need a distraction, Rogers said. He looked at the main reactor. X-99, can you overload the core? The tech priest looked at the reactor. The machine spirit will be angered. The explosion will vaporize the station. Do it, Rogers said. Set it for 5 minutes. Diana, we need to hold the breach. The next 5 minutes were the longest of Rogers' life. He stood at the edge of the pit where the Necrons were emerging. He used his shield to batter them back. He wasn't trying to kill them. He was trying to delay them. He was a cork in a bottle of green fire. Every impact jarred his bones. His muscles screamed. He was fighting machines that had slept for 60 million years. He was a man out of time fighting time itself. Diana fought the Black Legion. She held the main gate. She fought a Chaos champion, a monster wielding a demon hammer. She moved like liquid gold. She parried the hammer, the shockwave cracking the floor. She used her lasso to trip a defiler that was trying to climb through the breach. She shouted at the refugees to run. She herded them toward the waste chute. Go, don't look back, jump. The refugees hesitated. The chute was a black hole smelling of acid. Corgan was the first. He grabbed a child and jumped. He vanished into the dark. The others followed. It was a leap of faith into the abyss. The timer on the reactor ticked down. The Necron overlord finally emerged from the pit. He was massive, adorned in gold and turquoise royal raiment. He carried a war scythe that crackled with energy. He looked at Rogers. He spoke in a language that was not sound, but a direct transmission of mathematical contempt into the brain. He demanded Rogers kneel. He demanded the vermin vacate his property. Rogers spat blood on the floor. He stood up straight. He adjusted his shield. I don't kneel, he said. And this isn't your property. It's theirs. The Overlord swung the scythe. Rogers blocked. The blade cut into the edge of the Vibranium. For the first time, the shield was damaged. The metal shrieked. Rogers was thrown back against the reactor casing. The Overlord stepped forward to finish him. Diana was there. She abandoned the gate. She flew across the room and tackled the Overlord. They crashed into a pile of crates. The Overlord was strong, stronger than anything she had fought on this world. He grabbed her by the throat and lifted her. Primitive, the Overlord broadcast. Your biology is offensive. Steve, now, Diana shouted. Rogers looked at the reactor. The timer was at 0. He hit the manual override. He didn't run. He grabbed Diana's hand. He pulled her away from the Overlord. They sprinted for the waste chute. The Overlord roared, realizing the trap. He tried to phase out, to teleport away. The reactor breached. It wasn't a nuclear explosion. It was a plasma destabilization. A sphere of white fire expanded from the core. It consumed the Necron phalanx. It consumed the Black Legion squad at the door. It consumed the pumping station. The shockwave hit Rogers and Diana just as they dove into the chute. They were blasted down into the darkness, riding a wave of superheated air and debris. Above them, the pumping station Beta Rho ceased to exist. The collapse of the station brought down the ceiling of the cavern. Millions of tons of rock and ferrocrete fell onto the Necron Tomb entrance. It wouldn't stop them forever. The Necrons were patient. They would dig themselves out. But it bought time. It buried the immediate threat. Rogers hit the liquid of the sump sea. It was thick, oily, and cold. He surfaced, gasping. The air was foul. He engaged the rebreather on his cowl. He looked around. The darkness was total, save for the distant fires of the burning station above. He activated a flare. The red light revealed a nightmare landscape. The refugees were clinging to floating debris, pieces of scrap, and islands of hardened sludge. They were alive, wet, terrified, and lost in a toxic ocean, but alive. He found Diana. She was pulling people onto a raft made of piping. She looked at him. Her armor was stained with the black oil. She looked furious and exhausted. "We lost the water," she said. Rogers climbed onto the raft. He wiped the slime from his eyes. "We lost the station," he corrected. "We kept the people." "For how long?" Diana asked. "Where do we go now, Steve? There is no map for this." Rogers looked at the dark horizon of the underground sea. "We keep moving," he said. "We find land. We rebuild." High above Inspire Primus, Inquisitor Valerius watched the seismic readouts. The destruction of the pumping station registered as a massive structural failure. He slammed his fist onto the table. "They destroyed the asset," he shouted. "The water supply for the lower hive is gone. The logistical calculations are ruined." Lord General Vance looked at the screen. He saw something else. He saw the energy spikes of the Necrons flatline. "They also stopped the Xenos," Vance said quietly. "And the chaos advance in that sector has stalled. The enemy is confused. They don't know what happened." Valerius stared at the map. He saw the tactical reality. The destruction of the station had created a dead zone. No one could move through that sector now. It was a flank secured by annihilation. It was brutal. It was effective. It was exactly what he would have done, but he would have sacrificed the people to do it. The fact that Rogers had saved the population and destroyed the enemy base was a variable he couldn't reconcile. "They're in the sump," Valerius said. "Nothing survives the sump. The mutants down there are older than the Imperium. If the toxins don't kill them, the Pale Kings will." "Perhaps," Vance said, "but I wouldn't bet against them." In the depths of the sump, the consequences of Act 4 rippled out. The Necron dynasty was awake. They were trapped for now, but they were active. They sent signals into the void, calling for their fleets. The Black Legion, denied their prize and bloodied by the ghosts in the machine, turned their rage back to the upper hive. And in the dark water, Rogers and Diana floated on a raft of garbage, leading an army of the dispossessed into a territory that even the Space Marines feared to tread. The strategic situation had shifted from a defense of a city to a survival horror in the unknown. They had traded a fortress for a chance and water for time. Rogers looked at the refugees. They were shivering. He unclasped his cape, the tattered remains of the stars and stripes, and wrapped it around a woman holding a baby. He sat down and began to paddle. He didn't know it yet, But the massive outcome wasn't just the awakening of the Necrons. It was the awakening of something else. In the darkness of the sump, the people weren't praying to the Emperor anymore. They were watching the man in blue and the woman in gold. A new faith was growing in the dark, a heresy of hope that would threaten the Imperium more than any bomb. The toxic ocean of the sump was not merely water. It was a liquid history of industrial neglect. For 3 days, the raft of refuse carrying the last hope of the Orestes underclass drifted through the dark. Captain Steve Rogers sat at the prow, his eyes burning from the chemical fumes. The rebreather he wore was clogging, the filter turning black with the particulate matter of a dying world. Behind him, the refugees were silent. They had passed beyond fear into a catatonic state of survival. They huddled together for warmth, their skin pale and slick with the oily mist. Diana sat at the stern, her golden armor the only source of light in a cavern that stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath the hive city. She did not sleep. She watched the black water. She felt the vibrations in the deep, a rhythmic thrumming that was distinct from the mechanical grinding of the Necrons above, or the chaotic screaming of the surface war. This was biological. It was a heartbeat. The raft grounded on a shelf of calcified sludge on the 4th day. They had reached the root of the hive, the foundational pillars that supported the billions of tons of city above. Here, the architecture was so old it predated the Imperium. Massive columns of rusted iron rose into the darkness like the trunks of petrified trees. Rogers stepped off the raft. His boots sank into a carpet of strange, pale fungus. He signaled for Corgan. The sergeant looked like a corpse walking. His uniform was rags, his laser gun held together with a wire. Rogers pointed to the massive structure in the distance. It was a freight elevator, an archaeotech construct from the dark age of technology, designed to lift tithe-grade ore from the planet's core to the orbital docks. It was dormant, silent, and covered in the webs of the Pale Kings. The Pale Kings were not a myth. They were a biological inevitability. As the refugees began to disembark, the shadows moved. From the fungal forests and the rusted vents emerged creatures that were a mockery of the human form. They were purple and chitinous, with 4 arms and ridges of bone protecting their skulls. They were Genestealer hybrids, the 3rd and 4th generation offspring of a Tyranid vanguard organism that had infected the sump centuries ago. They did not attack immediately. They hissed, a sound like steam escaping a valve. They were waiting for the command of the Patriarch. Rogers raised his shield. He recognized the tactical disposition. They were being herded. He looked at Diana. She had drawn the Godkiller. The sword's light revealed the sheer number of them. Thousands. They clung to the pillars, the ceiling, the floor. They were the apex predators of the dark. Corgan whispered the name of the Emperor. He raised his laser gun, his hands shaking. Rogers told him to hold fire. He saw that the creatures were looking up. They were not looking at the humans. They were looking at the ceiling of the cavern. High above, miles through the rock and plasteel, a deep booming sound echoed. Dust rained down. Then came the green light. The Necrons had burned their way through the collapse. They were pursuing the energy signature of the anomalies. The Zarakan dynasty did not leave loose ends. The ceiling of the Sum cavern, stressed by the weight of the hive and the thermal lances of the Necrons, fractured. A massive slab of rock the size of a city block fell into the black ocean, creating a tsunami of sludge that washed over the landing zone. Rogers shouted for the civilians to run toward the elevator structure. The breach in the ceiling was a wound in the world. Through it poured the Necron warriors. They floated down on gravity-defying platforms, or marched down the vertical walls with magnetic locks. Their Gauss flares lit up the dark with the sickly green of tomb light. But they were not alone. The breach had opened a path for the surface war to bleed down. From the tear in the rock, drop pods painted in the black and gold of the traitor legions screamed down, their retro thrusters firing at the last second to slam into the fungal plain. The Black Legion had arrived to crush the refugees and claim the anomalies for Abaddon. It was the final convergence. 3 armies, 3 distinct philosophies of death, met at the bottom of the world. The Genestealer cult, the Pale Kings, shrieked as their territory was invaded. The Broodmind snapped. The Patriarch, a massive creature of muscle and rending claws, emerged from the elevator shaft. It roared, a psychic scream that made the refugees clutch their ears and bleed from the nose. The cultists charged, not at the humans, but at the invaders. They threw themselves at the Necrons with suicidal fury, their claws tearing at living metal, their bodies disintegrating under Gauss fire. Rogers saw the battlefield geometry. It was a kill box. The humans were in the center. The Necrons were descending from the north. The Chaos Marines were landing in the south. The Tyranids were emerging from the east. There was no way out. The elevator was their only chance, but it was powered down, and the Patriarch was guarding it. Rogers looked at Diana. He didn't have to speak. They had fought together for days. They knew the play. They had to be the distraction. They had to be the lightning rod that drew the fire of 3 armies so the civilians could slip through. Inquisitor Valerius's voice cut through the static of Rogers' vox bead. The signal was boosted by the proximity of the Chaos drop pods. Valerius sounded calm, cold, and final. He informed Rogers that the hive city above was lost. The governor's palace had fallen. The Black Legion controlled the spire. Valerius was in orbit on a frigate. He had authorized exterminatus. Cyclonic torpedoes were being loaded. He was going to burn the atmosphere and crack the crust to purge the Necron tomb and the Tyranid infestation. He offered Rogers a choice. He could teleport Rogers and Diana to his ship. The teleportarium Homer was in one of the Black Legion drop pods. They had 20 minutes before the torpedoes fired. He said the refugees were dead already. He said it was a mathematical certainty. He said heroes were rare, but peasants were infinite. Rogers looked at the refugees. He saw the mother he had given his cape to. She was shielding her child from the dust. He looked at Corgan, who was rallying his terrified men to form a firing line. Rogers pressed the vox bead. He told Valerius that he declined the offer. He told the Inquisitor that he was going to save the peasants. He told Valerius to hold his fire until he saw the signal. Valerius asked what signal. Rogers didn't answer. He ripped the bead from his ear and crushed it. "Diana," Rogers said, "we need to clear the elevator. I'll take the Patriarch. You keep the Necrons off the civilians." "And the Chaos Marines?" Diana asked, deflecting a stray bolt around with her bracelet. "They'll be too busy fighting the bugs," Rogers said. "Go." Rogers charged. He ran straight into the mass of the Genestealer cult. He used his shield like a battering ram. He smashed through the hybrids, ignoring their claws that raked his armor. He sprinted toward the Patriarch. The beast saw him. It recognized a challenger. It was 12 feet tall, a nightmare of purple flesh and razor-sharp bone. It lunged, faster than any human eye could track. Rogers didn't try to block. He slid underneath the lunge, the claws missing his head by millimeters. He planted his boot on the creature's knee and vaulted up, slamming the edge of his shield into its jaw. The impact cracked the chitin. The Patriarch roared and backhanded Rogers. Rogers flew 30 feet and crashed into a rusted pylon. His vision blurred. He tasted copper. He stood up. "Is that all you got?" he muttered. The Patriarch charged again. This time, Rogers stood his ground. He caught the creature's claws on his shield. The Vibranium groaned. He was holding back a biological bulldozer. Diana was fighting a war on a different scale. She stood between the refugee column and the advancing Necron phalanx. The Overlord from the pumping station had returned. He floated on a command barge, firing a tachyon arrow at her. She crossed her bracelets. The beam hit the divine metal and scattered, slicing a Black Legion dreadnought in half behind her. She leapt into the air, flying straight at the barge. She severed the gravity engines with the Godkiller. The barge crashed into the sludge. The Overlord fell out, his warseath crackling. Diana landed before him. They dueled in the center of the chaos. Ancient metal against divine steel. Sparks flew like fireworks. The Black Legion was confused. They had come to slaughter sheep and found themselves in a grinder. A squad of Khorne berserkers charged the Genestealers. It was a frenzy of chainaxes and claws. Blood and ichor sprayed the air. The Chaos Sorcerer leading the warband tried to cast a spell, but the shadow in the warp created by the Tyranids dampened his power. His head exploded from the psychic feedback. The discipline of the traitor Marines began to fracture. They were fighting enemies they hated more than the Imperium. Rogers was losing. The Patriarch was too strong, too fast. It grabbed his shield arm and began to squeeze. The armor crumpled. Rogers screamed. He saw Korgan leading the refugees into the elevator carriage. They were almost there. He needed more time. He saw a Black Legion hellbrute stomping toward the elevator, ignoring the Tyranids. If it reached the civilians, it would be a massacre. Rogers made a choice. He released the straps of his shield. He let the Patriarch rip it from his arm. He dropped a frag grenade into the open joint of the Patriarch's armor. He rolled away. The grenade detonated. It didn't kill the beast, but it blew off its primary claw arm. The Patriarch shrieked in confusion. Rogers sprinted toward the hellbrute. He had no shield. He had a combat knife and a stolen bolt pistol. He ran up the debris pile. He jumped onto the hellbrute's back. He jammed the pistol into the sensor cluster and pulled the trigger until the magazine was dry. The hellbrute went blind. It thrashed, firing its multi-melter wildly. One of the shots hit the Patriarch, vaporizing its chest. The Genestealer leader fell. The broodmind wavered. The hybrids hesitated. Korgan hit the activation rune for the elevator. Nothing happened. "It's dead," he screamed. "There's no power." Rogers looked at the massive power couplings at the base of the shaft. They were severed likely by centuries of neglect. The elevator needed a jump-start. It needed a massive surge of energy. Rogers looked at the Necron Overlord fighting Diana. He looked at the glowing resurrection orb on the Overlord's belt. It was a power source of immense density. "Diana," Rogers shouted. "The orb. Throw it into the coupling." Diana heard him. She understood. She parried the Overlord's scythe, ducked under his guard, and ripped the orb from his waist. The Overlord screeched a binary curse. Diana spun and threw the orb. It flew like a comet, glowing green. It smashed into the power coupling of the elevator. The Necron energy discharged instantly. The ancient machinery of the Dark Age woke up. The coupling arced with green lightning. The gears groaned, a sound like a dying mountain. The massive platform began to rise. The refugees were moving. They were ascending. But Rogers and Diana were still on the ground. The platform rose past them. Korgan reached out his hand. "Captain, jump!" Rogers looked at the rising platform. He looked at the army of Necrons regrouping. He looked at the Black Legion reinforcements pouring from the drop pods. He looked at the Genestealers who were now leaderless and frenzying. If they jumped, the enemy would shoot the elevator cables. Someone had to hold the ground. Someone had to draw the fire. "Go," Rogers said. He waved Corgan off. "Get them out." Diana landed beside him. She looked at the elevator ascending into the dark shaft. She looked at Rogers. She didn't argue. She stood back to back with him. She raised her sword. He raised his fists. He felt naked without the shield, but he felt lighter. "This is going to be a long 20 minutes, Rogers said. "We have faced worse," Diana said. "I don't think we have," Rogers replied, watching a defiler crawl over the pile of dead genestealers. The battle that followed was not recorded in the Imperial archives. It was too messy, too illogical. Two beings stood against the tide. Rogers fought with the weapons of the dead. He picked up a chainsword. He used a Necron shield. He moved like water. Diana was a whirlwind. She used her lasso to pull a Chaos Raptor out of the air and slam him into a Necron immortal. They fought not to win, but to exist. Every second they held was a meter the elevator climbed. High above, the elevator breached the upper atmosphere levels. The refugees saw the stars for the first time in their lives. They saw the Imperial fleet hanging in the void. Corgan fired a flare. The fleet saw them. Rescue shuttles were scrambled. In the sump, the time was up. The Vox bead on the dead Chaos Sorcerer crackled. It was Valerius. He was broadcasting on all channels. The anomaly has persisted beyond calculated limits. The extraction is complete. The infection remains. Initiating lance strike. Rogers heard it. He looked up. The ceiling of the cavern dissolved. A beam of pure white light, a lance from the heavens, pierced the hive city. It burned through the spire, through the hab blocks, through the manufactorum. It was the finger of God. It was coming for them. Rogers looked at Diana. The enemy stopped fighting. The Necrons looked up, calculating the yield. The Chaos Marines screamed as the light consumed them. The genestealers hissed and scattered. "Steve," Diana said. She sheathed her sword. She took his hand. She crossed her bracelets in front of them. She expanded her aura, a bubble of golden divinity. "Think it will hold?" Rogers asked, shouting over the roar of the incoming apocalypse. "It has to," Diana said. Rogers closed his eyes. He thought of Brooklyn. He thought of Peggy. He thought of the kid with the laser gun. He smiled. He didn't feel fear. He felt the satisfaction of the mission. The line had held. The lance strike hit. The sound was absolute. The sump evaporated. The fungal forest, the black ocean, the ancient pillars, all were turned to ash in a nanosecond. The sheer thermal output turned the bottom of the hive into a crater of glass. The shockwave destabilized the tectonic plates. The hive city above groaned and settled, collapsing inward on its own hollowed-out heart. In the silence that followed, there was nothing, no movement, no life. The radiation counters on the orbiting ships spiked to maximum. Valerius watched the hololith. The energy signature of the anomalies had vanished. The Necron tomb was buried under miles of molten rock. The Tyranid infestation was vaporized. The tactical objectives were achieved. "Casualty report?" Valerius asked. "Hive population, 99.4% fatal," the servitor droned. "Refugee transport secure. 104,210 survivors." Valerius nodded. He made the sign of the Aquila. "An acceptable margin," he said. He looked at the spot where the lance had struck. He zoomed in. The sensors showed a flat, glowing lake of magma. There was nothing left. But then, the sensor officer spoke up. His voice trembled. "Inquisitor, I have a reading." Valerius stepped forward. "A malfunction?" "No, my lord. It is faint. It is deep in the glass. It matches the resonant frequency of the shield." Valerius stared at the screen. Deep in the cooling crater, buried under the weight of a world, There was a heartbeat. It was faint, but it was there, and beside it, a golden thermal signature that refused to fade. Valerius reached for the exterminatus button again. His finger hovered over it. He thought of the elevator. He thought of the tactical data Rogers had provided. He thought of the Necron overlord being hurled into the reactor. He made a choice. It was the only choice an Inquisitor could make when faced with a miracle he couldn't sanction but dared not destroy. "Sensor glitch," Valerius said. "Clear the buffer. Record the targets as destroyed. Set course for the Mandeville Point. We are leaving." "But my lord," the officer started. "We are leaving," Valerius repeated. "Let the dead bury the dead." The fleet broke orbit. The planet of Orestes the was left a smoking ruin, a tomb for billions. But in the silence of the glass crater, under the light of the toxic stars, a hand punched through the crust. It was a hand clad in scorched blue armor. It grasped the edge of the crater. Then a second hand, glowing with dim gold light, reached up to pull. They pulled themselves out of the grave. They were burned, broken, and breathing. Rogers coughed, expelling ash. He looked at Diana. Her armor was dull, her hair singed. She looked at him and smiled. It was a tired smile, but it was real. "We missed the ride," Rogers rasped. "There will be another," Diana said. She looked to the sky. "The universe is full of wars, Steve." "Yeah," Rogers said. He stood up, unsteady. He looked at the horizon. "Let's find the next one." They began to walk across the glass plain, two specks of color in a world of grey. They walked into the history of the 41st millennium, not as conquerors, but as the only thing the galaxy had forgotten how to be. They walked as survivors. This ended not with a bang, but with the sound of boots on glass, walking away from the end of the world. The file concerning the pacification of Orestes V was sealed under the Vermilion Protocol, 72 hours after the exterminatus order was executed. Lord Inquisitor Valerius personally oversaw the scrubbing of the data slates. To the High Lords of Terror, he reported a standard containment operation against a Necron awakening and a Tyranid splinter fleet. He reported that the Hive City was lost to enemy action, and that the Lance Strike was a necessary mercy. He did not mention the two anomalies. He did not mention the shield that broke the laws of physics, or the lasso that burned with the light of truth. In his private journals, written in a cipher known only to himself and dead men, Valerius noted that the Imperium survived on dogma, and the existence of benevolent power outside the Emperor's grace was a heresy that would shatter the faith of billions. He chose to bury the truth to save the lie. The 104,210 survivors of the Sump were not returned to the general population. They were quarantined, processed, and eventually settled on a penal agri-world in the Rimwood Drift. They were meant to be forgotten, to work the fields until they died of exposure or fatigue. But ideas are harder to kill than men. Among these exiles, a new creed began to flourish. It was not sanctioned by the ecclesiarchy. It was whispered in the barracks and scratched into the walls of the grain silos. They spoke of the saint of the shield and the maiden of the cord. They did not pray to them as gods, for that would be heresy, but they venerated them as the Emperor's secret angels. Sergeant Corgan, who lived for another 30 years, missing a hand and half a lung, became the de facto priest of this quiet cult. He taught the children that duty was not just obedience to the lash, but protection of the weak. He taught them that even in the deepest dark, where the Emperor's light could not reach, there were those who would hold the line. A century later, the Agri-world raised a regiment for the Imperial Guard, the Orestes, first Deep Walkers. Their regimental banner did not bear the Aquila alone. Behind the double-headed eagle was a stylized white star on a blue field, and a coil of gold. The commissariat tried to have the banner burned, citing non-codex iconography. The regiment refused to march without it. The Departamento Munitorum, desperate for bodies to throw into the meat grinder of the 13th Black Crusade, relented. The Deep Walkers became known for their stubborn refusal to retreat. In the trenches of Cardia, they were famous for holding positions long after they should have been overrun. They fought with a strange, calm fury. When asked why they did not run, they would simply say that they were waiting for the captain. They believed he was still out there, walking the void, fighting the wars that no one else could win. The Mechanicus excavation teams that returned to Orestes V, 200 years later, found the planet a glass marble of silence. They drilled into the crust, seeking the necrodermis of the buried tomb world. They found nothing but slag. However, deep in the strata of the former underhive, the Magos archaeologists discovered a singular anomaly. It was a fragment of metal embedded in the vitrified rock. It was painted red, white, and blue. The scanners could not identify the alloy. It absorbed all Auspex scans. It vibrated with a faint, resonant hum. The Magos declared it a holy relic of the Dark Age of technology and had it transported to Mars. It sits there now, in a stasis vault, classified as Omega-level archaeotech. The tech priests who tend to it claim that sometimes, when the warp storms are high, the metal sings a song of impossible purity, a single clear note that hurts the logic circuits of those who listen too closely. As for the two wanderers, there were no confirmed sightings, but the galaxy is vast, and the war is eternal. In the centuries that followed, strange reports would drift in from the fringes of the Segmentum Obscurus, a colony saved from dark Eldar raiders by a warrior who fought with a primitive shield. A demon world destabilized when a woman in gold walked through the warp flames and the fire refused to burn her. These reports were dismissed as swamp gas, mass hysteria, or local folklore. The Inquisition filed them away. The Administratum lost them, but the soldiers knew. On 1,000 battlefields, when the ammo ran dry and the dark closed in, the guardsmen would grip their laser guns and tell each other the story of the soldier and the Amazon, the story that said the Emperor protects, but sometimes he sends help, the story that ended not with death, but with the promise that as long as one person stands against the darkness, the war is not lost, and somewhere in the void, amidst the drifting hulks and the burning stars, two figures walked on, looking for the next trench, the next hopeless cause, the next line to hold. The end of the chronicle is not a period, but an ellipse,